In this video, we're going to look at how regular sized objects can be charged. So in the last video, we introduced protons and electrons. And just to review here, so P stands for protons, and protons are particles that are positively charged, and electrons are negatively charged. Now here we're just talking about particles, not actual full-sized objects, right? These are particles that make up atoms, and those atoms are what make up everyday objects. Okay, so here's what that means. If we have a regular object, and let's just pretend that this is a balloon. So a balloon is made up of atoms. And what that means is if it's made up of atoms, that means that it already has protons and electrons all over this balloon, right? Spread out through the entire material, right? Because it's completely made up of protons and electrons. Now, one way that we could charge this object is by somehow getting rid of some of these electrons, so taking electrons away from the balloon, or we could somehow transfer electrons to the balloon. And depending on whether we're giving it electrons or we're taking electrons away, that will determine whether the object becomes positively charged or if it becomes negatively charged. If you can take electrons away from an object, it will have more protons and therefore will be positively charged. So what's important here is to remember that if you take electrons away from an object, it will become positively charged. And if you can transfer electrons to an object, it will have more electrons and therefore will be negatively charged. So just remember, if you transfer electrons to an object, then it will be negatively charged because now it has more electrons than protons. And so let's go ahead and talk about a couple of ways that we can charge an object. So one charging method that we will talk about here is friction. Charging by friction is something that you have probably done before. So if you were to take a balloon and you were to rub it on your shirt or maybe your hair, so let's say this is you and you're rubbing the balloon on your head, on your hair, then what you see is that the balloon makes your hair stick up. And basically what is happening here is your hair is giving electrons to the balloon, or the balloon is taking electrons away from your hair. And what happens then is your hair now has a positive charge and the balloon now has a negative charge, and opposite charges attract. You've also seen this before. If you ever walk across the carpet and then maybe you touch a doorknob, you get shocked. And basically what is happening is you are taking electrons from the floor by rubbing across the carpet, and then you are transferring that charge to the metal doorknob, which is a conductor. And we'll talk more about insulators and conductors here in another video. But here we're just looking at the different charging methods, and then we're going to look at how the two types of charged objects behave when close to each other. So we already talked about here how the reason why your hair sticks to the balloon is because your hair is positive, the balloon is negative, and opposite charges attract. Okay, so while we're talking about that, opposite charges attract. So let's go ahead and write this down here. So opposite charges attract, and if you have two objects that have the same charge, they will repel. Very similar to a magnet, right? So if you have a magnet and you bring the north and south pole together, they attract. Or if you bring two poles that are the same, let's say south and south or north and north, then they will repel. And in a future video, you will see how charged objects can attract other objects that have zero charge. Another method for charging is by conduction. And we just talked about a case where you've actually seen this before. So The case where you are walking across the floor and you get shocked by the doorknob, what's happening is you are gaining charge or losing charge by friction with the ground. And then when you reach for the doorknob, you are giving your charge to the doorknob. So all you had to do to charge the doorknob is touch it. So conduction involves charging an object with another charged object. And the result here is that both objects will have the same charge. So if you're positively charged and you touch another object that, for example, like the doorknob gets the same charge that you have. Now, charging by friction, as we've seen here, the two objects get the opposite charge. So when you charge by friction, the result is that the two objects the two objects involved get the opposite charge. So the two objects involved are oppositely charged. And there's another method for charging that we will talk about in a future video. But next you are going to look at a few demonstrations of how charged objects interact with each other.